true tradition of small steps and giant leaps, Alder asked me to talk about what will Mars look like in 10,000 years. And of course, we're going to speculate on what that might be. But many scientists are actually working on aspects of that problem, meaning how to terraform Mars. Now, humans are on this planet, and we're doing a heck of a job terraforming this one. As soon as we show up at Mars, that's naturally going to happen. So what are the processes, what are the thinking in terms of doing that, and then how could it evolve and what it might look like? And there's certain stages, so there's levels of terraforming that we would expect to accomplish. But we want to have a permanent presence on another planet. And of course, NASA's plan is to first go to the moon, learn to live and work on a planetary surface, and then go to Mars, okay? And there's a lot we learn by doing that in terms of using resources, 3D printing, all the things that many of you are involved in new technologies, deploying instruments, getting data, and understanding much more about the science and the origin and evolution of the Earth-Moon system and the rest of the solar system. But how do we get to that point? Well, we get to that point through small steps. NASA in the 60s started a process of not only building spacecraft to look at the Earth-Moon environment because of the Apollo program, they also started launching missions out into the solar system. And of course, NASA didn't do very well early on. I think the first 4 lunar missions were all failures, one of which they wanted to crash on the moon. They even missed the moon. And now, how could you miss the moon? But that's what they did. And so these are all small steps leading up to some really fantastic knowledge about each and every one of the objects they visit. I was head of planetary science at NASA for about 12 years. And we implemented a program that NASA is still doing now in a stepwise fashion, in small steps, how we learned about certain objects over a period of missions, over a period of time. And the mantra is, fly by. It's the first thing you do, is you understand what the object is all about, then make decisions you want to go back to it. So what do you do next? You orbit, you land, you rove, and you return samples. Now we've done all those to the moon, and we're nearly there for Mars, okay? And we brought all kinds of samples back from the Apollo program from the moon, and right now we're in the process of figuring out how to bring samples back that are being created right now on Mars in our first sample return mission. But that's got to be the start of a number of sample returns. And indeed, we'll talk a little bit about that. But to set up the concept of what Mars might look like in 10,000 years, you need to know what we know about Mars today and whether there's life on Mars today. Carl Sagan said if we find life on Mars, we should leave it for the Martians. But I think the general thinking now is that's not going to happen. And there's a variety of reasons for that. But first, let's really interrogate Mars, figure out what's there, whether there is Martians there. And it's probably not this one that from the movie The Martian. So, Mary Beth, tell us what's going on in Mars exploration today.
Okay, so we're going to rewind all the way to the beginning of the story of Mars. So this is a picture, an artist's conception of what Mars may have looked like in its very earliest epoch. So you can see that it looked a lot more like Earth does. It had shallow seas, it had weather patterns, and it had a thicker atmosphere, and it also had a protective magnetosphere, which is really important in the formation of life because it allows protection of our fragile biomolecules. So Mars and early Earth have a lot of very similar properties. And over time, because of its smaller size, the solar wind stripped that atmosphere away and it dried up. But for the first billion years, there weren't a whole lot of differences between early Earth and early Mars. So this is a picture, from the first landed mission to Mars from Viking, which landed in the 70s. And next year, we're going to be celebrating 50 years since the Viking landers, which is super exciting. But it was a little bit shocking when they first put down Viking, because the paradigm at the time is they were expecting, from orbit, they could see these, carved channels and a lot of evidence for water activity. And when they got down onto the surface, they were like, oh man, this place is really barren, it's really desolate. But I have a lot of respect for the scientists and engineers that put together Viking, because they really went for the gusto, and they've done the first and the only experiment on another body to look for life. Like, honest to God, look for life. And so not only were they going to find it, they were going to grow it. They brought media, they were going to culture organisms and look for the products that had off-gassed. And so I think there was something that happened at that time, right after, where there was a sense of sort of failure, which I think is healthy in science, right? Like, you want to do experiments that don't always work 100% of the time. But it also kind of shifted the paradigm away from Mars for a little while. And it wasn't until the discovery of a meteorite from Mars in the 1990s, where they found potentially that didn't turn out to be what they suspected at the time might be body fossils of organisms, that spurred up the Mars program again, and then all of a sudden we had a flush of missions from the 90s until now. So this is a picture from the Curiosity rover, which landed on Mars in 2012, and it's really beautiful. I don't know if you guys can see these like gorgeous stratigraphic layers, and all of these mudstones and clays. Those are laid down by water, and there was a lake that existed here 4 billion years ago. So one of my favorite things about Mars is that you see these same sorts of things on Earth, but they're typically very young. And so because this is from that really early epoch, it's almost perfectly preserved. So as a scientist, we can go and look and study these rocks and understand about conditions long ago. And on Earth, we have active tectonism, and the plates move around, and all of our continental crust gets recycled. So we don't have anything like this that's of this age on Earth. So it's kind of a cool opportunity to study that time period and those types of conditions in the solar system, because all of that evidence has been wiped down on Earth. Okay, so I promise this is the most technical plot you'll see tonight. But this is a scale showing the history of Mars going back to the beginning of Mars. So you can see that during the early period of time, you have magnetism, you have tectonism, you have these early environments where there are clays and all these things, and then a list of all of the missions, some of the missions that have explored that region, and they are all exploring that period of time. But you can see as we get closer to the present that those things sort of disappear. And so all of the conditions that we think are important for habitability and for life, those disappeared over time. And so for the last 2 billion years, Mars has been probably one of the biggest deserts you can ever imagine. So before I turn it over to Jim, I want to talk a little bit about the search for life, which is what I do when I study some of the technologies that I work on. And in particular, how we're sort of applying those practices to Mars. So this is a quote from probably one of my favorite scientists. His name is James Lovelock. He was one of the philosophers who worked on Viking. And he set some of the framework for the very first life detection experiments. And he wrote this really beautiful book in the early 70s called Gaia, which was thinking about the Earth not as a set of different physical processes, chemical processes, atmospheres, organisms, but as like one when you zoom out enough, one big organism. And he was one of the first people to put that forward. And so in his book, he says, our recognition of living things is instant and automatic. And our fellow creatures in the animal world seem to have that same facility. And I really love that, because it's true. Like, you know that when you go to those restaurants that have like the fake plastic fruits, that they're not appetizing. You immediately know it's not alive. And it's really interesting to start thinking about, okay, how do you start to codify that intuition into a scientific framework, and then a series of instruments, measurements that you'd actually want to make off-world. So we know of a lot of aspects of life, some that we expect are universal, like the building blocks that make up all of our proteins, the containment structures that make up our cells, different catalysts, or the very information polymers that encode our DNA and connect us with every other living organism on Earth. So combined, these indicators can provide conclusive evidence of life. And so part of what I'm doing at NASA is trying to come up with technologies to actually detect these in situ. And so right now at NASA Ames, we're working on a really cool suite of technologies to take some of the fluidics and a lot of my engineering team used to work in really neat startups in Silicon Valley. And then kind of came into the space sector, they built small sats, and now we're trying to apply their knowledge to planetary environments. And so using all of these technologies that have come online in the last 20 years, and think about how do we replicate the types of capabilities we have at the lab to something that we can fly someday. So, so now we know some of the things we might want to look for. Where would we want to look for that? So if we're going after ancient life, we want to try to find things that are from that earliest epoch and maybe buried in Earth's history. And these features are like super groovy. They're like one of my favorite geologic features in the solar system. They're called mud volcanoes, and they're not actually igneous processes, they're sedimentary processes. But the way that these particular features were formed is really interesting. So these volcanoes we see them at the end of a huge outflow channel on Mars. So early on, when you had those shallow seas, all of that water flowed through these channels. And then it cooled. And then it probably went underground. And so we have these nice cartoons we drew of kind of where some of those materials may have been buried that contained water. And then about 1 billion years ago, there was a nearby magma body that was really hot that got close to these things. And they just sort of like leaped out onto the surface. It's not a very energetic volcanic event. But what's pretty cool is that like there's potentially stuff that was buried here that was preserved very well for most of its history, that's connected in with those earliest epochs that were very habitable, and now is sitting out on the surface, ready to be explored. And so these are some of the most exciting features that I'm personally interested in trying to explore. But if you're interested in places that are currently habitable, because as I mentioned, Mars has been a really dry, dusty desert for 2 billion years. And I'll tell you, after spending the better part of the last decade in the Atacama Desert in Chile, where it only rains once every 10 years, there's nothing more lethal than desiccation. It turns out to be a really high bar for survival of microbial life. So it might make sense on Mars to go after features where we think there might be permeate water. So on the right, you can see images that were taken many months apart of these things called recurrent slope lineae. Super controversial in my field. If I brought this up at the American Geophysical Union, the whole crowd would be erupting in anger. It would be like West Side Story battle going on. But they're really interesting, and potentially a place where there is evidence of water on Mars today. And so, they're on the side of a cliff. Very hard to explore that with our current technologies, but some new things are coming online. So I'm really excited about the next few decades of exploration. So we might be able to actually get to some of these places. Okay, and my last slide, I wanted to talk about something that keeps me up at night, which is like, what do we do if we actually find evidence of life? So the next few decades, NASA's starting to get serious again about the search for life, and that's now risen to the top of the priority list for what we might do in the next 20 to 30 years, both with return samples that will come back from Mars and potentially in situ. So what do we do if we find that? So first, I think you have to think about what those organisms would actually look like. They're not like these like super awesome vintage ET guys. They're probably very slow growing, very small or microscopic, resistant to radiation and degradation, and they're probably like barely hanging on. Given what we sort of know about life on Earth in those types of environments. So it's worth thinking about how we might develop infrastructure or conduct our exploration such that we can, if we do find them, that we can maybe protect their environment or maybe not contaminate it before we find that evidence. for life. Because as you know, maybe you don't know, but I live this every day. The government moves very slow in exploration, and I feel very heartened by the pace of commercial activity. It's really exciting to be here, surrounded by all of this energy and all these ideas and people who are investing time and energy and money into building new technologies to get us off this planet. So y'all might outpace us, and like, please do it, because that means we'll get to do more science. But I think it's also important to be thoughtful about how we do it and who we might be disrupting if we do find it. If we don't find life, well, that's also really interesting, and that helps us understand and place our knowledge in a greater context about biology. If there's only one example of life, like that's actually crazier than having two. And because Mars and Earth were so similar early in its history, this is the most obvious place to look for it. So if there's not life on Mars, that's telling us something really interesting about Earth. Okay, so with that brief overview, I'm going to turn it over to Jim to now talk about future.
So indeed, we haven't found life on Mars yet. We're in the process of coring rock and creating a set of samples, like a piece of chalk. For those younger members of the audience, it's never used a chalkboard. It's more like a large Crayola crayon, right? And then we're putting them in a tube and bringing them back. So why don't we bring back the rock quicker? Well, geology today and understanding the Earth in the Earth's past is all done through the rock record. We found all kinds of interesting and fascinating things about the evolution of the Earth. And we're anticipating doing that when we bring this rock record back from Mars. There are 5,700 minerals that we have found on this Earth, and 349 of them can only be made with dead life, right? So that means in that rock record, we might be able to find, as we go back in history in the rock, an era on Mars from which there was vegetation and some sort of life that we have been ubiquitous on the planet, or at least from the area that we're bringing these rocks back. That is indeed the very first set of samples that we're bringing back, and even though we bring it back and we get a null set, we're still moving forward with our plans of going to Mars. So this is an overview of NASA's original plan for going to Mars. It establishes what we call an exploration zone. And that's about 200 kilometers in diameter, okay? And we're planning to go back and forth there each and every time for perhaps several hundred years, right? So unlike the movie The Martian, where there were, every time they would go, they'd go to a different location. That might be nice, but that infrastructure is just too hard to replicate over and over again. So in this area, we'll land in one place, we'll live in another place. We want to be able to use resources. As Mary Beth says, you look at these craters, and sometimes at certain seasons, it looks like they are weeping water. So as the sun beats down on the crater wall, just during the right time during the summer, maybe sublimating a water plug, and water comes pouring down the crater wall. So that we believe Mars has aquifers, just like the Earth does. And of course, what happens, and we know this from an astrobiology perspective, when the environment gets tough, life moves into the rocks. And you talk to the astrobiologists, and what you find out is there's more biomass below our feet than all the biomass on the surface of the Earth, including all the life in the ocean. So life has an extreme hold on this planet. Now, we're not going very deep when we create that rock record and we bring it back. And so it really may rely on humans going to Mars to actually find out if there's life or not and answer that question. Are we alone? And then, of course, we have to figure out if that's past life and current life, how we're going to live and work together. And there's many ideas and thoughts on why that's important. So here's the exploration zone. ISRU opportunities are all over the place. All right? This is extremely important. We need to know the composition of the dust. We need to know the mineralogy of the rocks in and around it. We need to know if there are pathogens in the soil, because you're going to be growing plants, you're going to be doing a number of things. We already know there's perchlorates, which are a poison to humans. some life here on Earth would eat these type of perchlorates, but it's not everywhere, and it's in a thin layer. It actually can be leached out and washed off very easily. So we need to know enough about these areas to really manage it. Because Mars had an enormous amount of water, and may have started plate tectonics, but didn't do it very, very long and not very extensively, the crust is full of water. There's frozen water everywhere in this crust. And so that means we have an excellent opportunity to be able to extract that water. And water, of course, is one of the critical things. Not only can we drink it, but we can take it apart, we can breathe it, and we can take it apart and use it for rocket fuel too. So some of these ISRU activity things that we need to do are going to be critical to maintain civilizations on Mars. So here's our first start at it. It's an exploration zone. And it's going to be pretty primitive, okay? We're going to be setting up some habitats. We're going to be working out in the field. We're going to be examining the radiation environment. And it's harsh. We already know it's harsh. The atmospheric pressure on Mars is 1% or so of our pressure here on Earth. So that means you need to wear a spacesuit, okay? If you didn't have a spacesuit on, even though it's very, very cold, 70 below zero typically, your blood would boil. There's just not enough pressure to keep your body together, all right? And your liquids together, which you got to have, obviously. And so that pressure is one of the first things you have to start building up. You want to get to the point where, in the future, if you can go from the 6 millibar pressure that it has today to 60 millibar pressure in the future, by beefing up the atmosphere in a number of ways, you then are at the Armstrong limit, and you can leave your spacesuit at home, and you can walk out onto the surface, and it gives you greater mobility, and that's very important, because that would be the first level in this concept of gradually having humans on Mars living and working, and you could call that first level of terraforming, if you will. Also, the ability to go out and use the soils, bring them into greenhouses and grow them, but what also will happen will indeed be genetically engineered plants that will be able to survive on the surface. So there's a number of things that are being researched now in those particular areas. In Japan, at Kyoto University, they have a chamber where they're growing trees in Mars' atmospheric pressure. All right? When I saw that experiment several years ago, I thought, oh, this is fantastic. You know, trees are just wonderful, bringing the CO2 and starting emitting oxygen. How did you come up with that idea? Why trees? And it was very simple. The Japanese investigator said, we love wood. And so that's how some of these things start. The energy in Japan is for, thousands of years was burning wood. They don't have a natural resource of coal and many of the resources that we have elsewhere in the earth because they were so small. So they have to be creative. We have to think about how to do that. But indeed, the ability someday then to start that process of growing outside the habitat is a huge step. Well, how are we going to build up the atmosphere? And what else is going on the planet? Because the atmosphere is so thin and it no longer has its magnetic shield, its magnetosphere, is high energy particles that are generated in supernova explosions and then pour their way in and through our solar system. They're called galactic cosmic rays. Can be not only moving very fast, but very big. And then they go right through your body because they go right through spacecraft. And they can kill every cell as it goes in and it comes out. Okay? Your body has to regenerate those. So if you get enough of that radiation, your body can't keep up with regenerating those, then you die of radiation poisoning. But so you need some sort of shield. Typically, our shield has been two parts to it. One is the magnetosphere of the sun, called the heliosphere. That prevents about 75% of the cosmic rays getting in. And then our atmosphere, along with our magnetic field, are good shields. So what we're doing now is we're thinking about how to protect ourselves from these high-energy cosmic rays. The sun also puts out high-energy particles, not quite as high in energy as these cosmic rays. but a lot more of it, and certainly during solar cycles. We have to worry about that. And then because Mars doesn't have its magnetic field anymore, and it doesn't have its magnetosphere, we're finding that the solar wind is stripping the oxygen out from the atmosphere. Now it turns out Mars's atmosphere is actually fairly humid. So there's water in the atmosphere. The sun disassociates the oxygen and the hydrogen as the water in the atmosphere moves up. And then the water is gone because you've broken it apart. The hydrogen leaves the planet because it's light enough to do that. The oxygen gets stripped in the solar wind, and so you lose it all over the place. One of our spacecraft, Megan, is making measurements of doing that. But if you can create a magnetic cocoon that can do a variety of things, such as stopping the stripping, such as protecting astronauts that are on the surface from cosmic rays, then that's the approach to do. And so right now, this concept of creating an artificial magnetosphere is being done in supercomputers, all right? So what's the orientations and how big of fields do we need? And all those concepts are being investigated. Now, this is what we have to do to really understand what's going on there, is playing with the physics that we know and in a domain that we can manage and manipulate to be able to create an environment for which we then can live and work, right? And so here's one of the models. There's Mars, and then here upstream is a large magnetic field that's generated at the Mars Lagrangian point called the L1. This is a very nice point because it actually follows the planet as it goes around the sun and is always pointing in that direction and produces a field that pushes the solar wind out of the way. Now, what does it look like? Well, does that wind come back? Yeah, a little bit of it. But this is why we do the modeling to determine how good a magnetic shield this is in the solar wind. We also know that there's huge magnetospheric storms that occur when the sun gets really active. That happens every several hundred years. That may have really horrible effects on the atmosphere of Mars, and that this would prevent those kind of things. There's really good modeling that's going on. You can see that it actually blocks a lot of the chaos that happens in the atmosphere, the stripping and the oxygen. Here on the right is the model with the shield, and it stops about 2 orders of magnitude in this oxygen stripping. The pressure on Mars is 6 millibars. It's going to maintain that because it's come to an equilibrium. The planet outgasses and the solar wind strips. So it outgasses at a rate it strips. So if it can stop the stripping, then the gas is going to increase, and with the gas increasing, we get a temperature increase. Now that doesn't mean in any time soon we're going to have anything near like the pressure of Earth. But as I mentioned, we have to work our way up as we emit more gas into the environment, as it naturally starts to outgas, and capture that and keep it going. Here's probably an analysis that's being done, the best place to put a magnetic field and create an artificial magnetosphere. And it turns out it's at areosync, it's at the synchronous orbit of Mars. And it's not just one current system that generates the field, it's 4. If you put 4 in a pattern, you literally can cover the planet, and you can prevent a lot of the problems that we see with Mars being naked, so to speak, in the solar wind. So this analysis, once again, is done in computers so that we can analyze and see what happens. Well, what really is the end result? What will happen in 10,000 years? Several groups are actually modeling that right now, and some of the best modeling seems to indicate we're not going to live on the surface, we're going to live inside the crater walls, okay? And so here's what one of these tubes look like. Here's an entire city of rooms. It's like your high rises here. Many of you are going to go home or go to the hotel and walk to the 5th floor and be in your room. Well, we crawl in your tube. And the tubes, they're designed and have really nice capabilities and facilities. And then also, you end up with systems that have huge amounts of solar panels for power. There's probably Mars thermal power. We know that Mars is still active. in the sense that its core is still molten. And so heat is leaving the planet, and so where can we go to actually take advantage of that and heat our habitats and then put it in these cliff homes? And then, of course, you're growing trees and plants in these environments and begin that process. So even in 10,000 years, it's not going to look like Earth, right? But if you've been in the Southwest or if you've been in the Middle East and you've looked at these areas, it's going to remain that way for long periods of time. But one of the key triggers will happen is when we get to the point where we actually can leave our spacesuit at home and begin to live and work outside the habitat. And then Mars will become a much more habitable environment. And I think that in 10,000 years, that's indeed possible. So thank you very much. We're going to answer any questions. Yeah. So how much more time do we have? What time do you want? That might be your own line, right? I'm happy to answer. Mary Beth can come out and we can answer any questions you might have. And Dennis has got his hand up right away.
Hey, Jim, what is field strength from the
So the field strength is approximately a third of what the Earth generates. Yeah. Now, we haven't been able to develop a system that generates that type of field. But there's places like a Rutherford Appleton laboratory that's generating enormous fields because they're working on confinement in tokamaks. And so they're well on the way of figuring out how to do that. It's going to require a massive power source. Now, whether that power source is going to be powered by, solar panels out in solar wind, but more than likely it'll be nuclear power sources. Yes? Yes?
The most promising Mars,
Yeah. So the question is, where's our best bet at finding life? I think it's Europa. I also think there's a good possibility of life on Mars, but it's in the ground, and it's probably in these aquifers, and it might be on the way out. Okay? And the best thing that might happen is for humans to show up. Because once we understand that life and be able to really provide an environment for it to survive, it might be a very important, not only revolutionary discovery, but a very important discovery for humankind, because it's lived in a very harsh environment. So it's genetically evolved. That's what life is all about. The life that metabolizes, it reproduces, and it evolves. So that life has evolved under really harsh conditions for billions of years. How did it do that? What's its makeup? And how did we benefit from that? So there's a lot of thinking about what kind of astronauts are going to show up on Mars. More than likely, the requirements for those astronauts would be based on genetics and not on personality so much. All right? And they won't be picky eaters either. They'll eat whatever they can. Yes? Yeah. So, so the concept is, would there be microbes in the rock record? We don't believe that's the case. Okay, so there's shallow enough pores that it's really about the history of the planet over, tens of millions of years is probably what we've got in the samples. So, but it is, the cores that we're taking are at a delta, okay? Beautiful delta in a crater. It's called Jezero Crater. And if you can think about the United States, stop the Mississippi and drain the Gulf of Mexico, where New Orleans is at a delta. So sediment has been brought down the river and it drops, and it just builds up. And in that sediment, there's tons of past life. And so that's why we're at that delta, really taking a look at what that delta was like in the past, and whether, Mars's river brought this life down and then died and laid in the delta. But it's not expected to see real microbes.
That being said, we are we're actually on a committee right now where we're looking at what are the qualifying factors it has to have to deem that it has nothing alive in it so that we don't Andromeda strain the Earth. So like there are committees, there's documents, there's a containment facility that's going to be built such that those samples can be analyzed in a protected place before they're released for analysis. So but yeah, the chances of it are like really. Oh, yes. So we do have requirements it's called planetary protection. And we have these guiding documents that tell us how much we have to sterilize our spacecraft or instruments. If you land at a place that is deemed more habitable, there are stricter requirements. If you're, interactive with the sample, then there are stricter requirements. So like that's like been a part of NASA since like Viking? Viking, yeah. I haven't thought much about synthetic life, but I know there are people I work with that have thought more intelligently about it. So, we understand the building blocks of life. We understand where they came from. We can see in the rock record when the first evidence of life shows up. But that link between the two, like when does something stop being chemistry and start being biology, there's a gap there, and there's a lot of people, probably know some of them, that are researching that. But I haven't really thought about much about like how we could use that to, further enhance the pace of exploration. I know there are some folks also working on like how do you use biomaterials to build structures and shielding materials, so that's also seems like a possibility over like timescales that Jim was talking about.
So I'll mention one thing. There's a lot of scientists that believe the astronauts are really going to live and work on the planet and have been genetically engineered. Okay? And this comes from scientific research that's based on the twin study. Okay? So if you want to learn more about this topic, read Chris Mason's book called The Next 500 Years. Okay? It talks about the evolution of medical technology and how that's coming at the right time to really be able to facilitate humans living and working on the right planet. Yes? Yeah, so the question is, what are some of the manufacturing activities that are being thought of, and what does it take to come in and out of the atmosphere? And indeed, it's going to require a lot. We're going to be relying on Earth for thousands of years. And there will come a point when all of a sudden Mars becomes self-sufficient. And that might happen in that 10,000 year reign. And then that's going to be an independent world. And because of the low gravity and the way we may have to genetically modify, people will be able to survive this climate, which is very cold and a very thin atmosphere, and very low gravity with respect to the Earth. It's got like 38% the gravity of Earth. Okay. I don't know, those people will evolve very differently. Okay, hands up on that one. I'll let you.
Well, Gil, rest in peace. Yeah, I mean, so he's talking about this experiment called the labeled release experiment. That was one of the packages on Viking, and they took media and they tried to that was labeled with a heavier carbon, such that if there were microbes chewing on it and then releasing products back, you could see that incorporation of that element. So there was a flaw in the experiment in the sense that they didn't fundamentally understand the chemistry of the planet before they went into heat. And so there's all of these oxidants in the soil. And Jim talked about perchlorates. That's the most famous example that is believed to be responsible by the vast majority of the scientific community. Yeah, I'm not quite sure. I'll have to go back and read some of his later papers before he passed. But I don't really remember his reasoning as to why.
Yeah, so instead of a metabolic process, where you take the existing materials and all of a sudden you end up with a biosignature, it becomes a chemical reaction. And it's probably the perchlorates that are doing that. But here was the kicker. There's 3 light detection instruments on Viking. And the agreement was, before the Viking mission was even launched, that all 3 instruments had to have a positive indication of life before they would have a press conference and all come out and say, we found life, we found evidence of life. The other 2 did not. So what Gill was missing was detailed knowledge of the chemistry of the soils. So this tells you that was a step too far. That wasn't small steps, that was a big leap. And that was a problem because we then didn't understand what was happening, and that occurred, that misunderstanding lasted several decades. Okay? So we're now back into the small steps, incrementally moving ahead as our understanding grows about Mars. Within 10 to 20 years, it may not be even 20, we will have all the basic knowledge for us to really begin the process of having humans go there. So we're nearly there in this incremental process of learning about Mars. Other questions? Yes, Shane. These are computer simulations, so they're only done in computers, so there's no satellite associated with it. They're just right now, large current loops. Some of the current loops that we think that can be generated is using hot gases that then go, that are ionized, we call those plasmas, that then go from terminal to terminal to terminal, and it ends up creating this current. And of course, the intensity of that current produces, and the speed will produce the magnetic field associated with it. The nice thing about the field is we can change its direction. We can change its intensity, we can change its direction. In fact, just a little change in the intensity from one dipole to another will cause a measurement to be made on the surface of the magnetic field that can give you longitude and latitude. So you can even use the magnetic field as a way to navigate in and around the planet over very large distances. Okay. Oh yeah, second, yeah, it said 2 questions, yes, okay. Good question. So we know about climate change here, okay? How we know about climate change is we actually found out that Venus had a runaway greenhouse. And the concept of a runaway greenhouse, those scientists, those planetary scientists led by Jim Hansen at the GISS Institute, Goddard Institute of Space Studies up in New York, brought those codes to an Earth framework and then began to play with the CO2 concentration and then began to see the start of that process happening here on Earth. So it was the planetary scientists using the supercomputing capability at the time, making predictions of the future that alerted us to the concept of climate change. That's what we are with Mars right now. We're playing in the supercomputer. What can we do to that environment that would aid humans being able to live and work on the surface? So that's kind of the parallel when we start with those processes. Okay? 2 more questions right here.
I think there's a gentleman over here. Yes.
Yeah, so my basic question is this: how does out here some buildings have to work? Was came up with the exponential processing accelerate. It's like it was the same. Now, what were those? Because
Yeah, good question. You know, what's with the 10,000 years? And could certain turning points happen sooner? And the answer is, Alder gave me the number. He said, what happens in 10,000 years? So I took my best shot at it. No one's really taken a series of these ideas and began to put them together to create a timeline to look if there are turning points in that analysis such that certain things happen more rapidly than others. We have a global circulation model of Mars. It actually is running in eggs. And we have tweaked it. We've added pressure, we've changed the temperature, we've done a number of things to see how the environment of Mars changes, okay, under certain conditions that aren't physical today, but may be modeled in the future as the environment of Mars changes, okay? And we've gotten some really promising results out of that. And so that's the start of the concept of playing with these models. But we haven't found a place where all of a sudden things happen exponentially just yet. Okay, I got one more question before the sound does the same. Yes? Yeah. Yeah, so really good question. So we've started to take a look at what we need to put down in an exploration zone, how much mass needs to be on the ground before we have an infrastructure to support humans. And the current number is 40 ton. Right now with Curiosity and with Perseverance, that's 1 metric ton. Add the sky crane to it, and you probably have close to 1.5 metric tons or so. That's what we can put down on the ground right now. However, we have the capability of bringing 30 ton to Mars today. It's called the Space Launch System. So the SLS can actually deliver 30 ton. The key is how do we get it down on the ground? And we'd have to do that with some sort of large ablative surface to slow it down on the entry, and then retro rockets to set it down on the ground. What about the Starship? All right, yes. Well, the Starship also is a super heavy lift launch vehicle, just like the SLS. So we can't wait until it comes. That's going to be an exciting time, and we'll have two choices. They each have their pros and cons, and they'll each be able to deliver massive amounts of material at different locations. The Starship is under development right now, okay? Now, Elon's got to have 3 completely successful launches of the Starship before we put a robotic spacecraft on it, okay? And he's got to have 7 more before we put a human on it. So he has quite a bit of work to do. But there's no reason to think that he's not going to be able to pull that off. It's just a matter of time. But in the meantime, we have the SLS. So how much is NASA expecting? Well, you have to figure out what that first step is, and I just showed you. That's the exploration zone. And we're going to need about 40 ton down on the ground to get that started. Okay? All right, I'm turning it back over.
Big round of applause.